We are now on verse 187 of the verses pertaining to fasting in Surah Baqarah, and we finished on the verse regarding prayer and the link between fasting and prayer. There was one thing I forgot to mention, is that there's a variant on this last verb. It says فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي, so let them respond to me, وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي, and believe in me, لَعَلَّهُمْ, that perhaps they might, يَرْشُدُونَ, find guidance. And I spoke about all those. So there's another version that says يُرْشِدُونَ. Yorshidun is a fourth form, or third form in the course that I teach, I call it Yorshidu, which here means to give guidance to others. So the first form, this one, means to be guided. This means to give guidance to others. And so لَعَلَّهُمْ يُرْشِدُونَ, so they can guide others. I don't think it's one of the main variants of the Quran, to be honest. But that's another point that's the one point I forgot to add from the previous lesson. Yep, Yorshidu, so they can guide others. That's the nuance there. So, if you'll notice that the verses have been talking about the rulings pertaining to fasting. That's been the main. We started with talking about, let me just bring it up, taqwa. Then we talked about so fasting has been prescribed in order for us to gain taqwa, and it's a path that others have treaded throughout time, and that but even though this is a difficulty, there are dispensations for people, and that is they can make them up, or they can feed in place of making up. And whether is it better to fast or not fast when you have that dispensation, that's what's been covered. And then we had a verse talking about that this is the month of Ramadan, we're talking about in which the verse that we're fasting, which is the month in which the Quran was revealed. And another purpose of the fasting is to gain guidance. When we fast, we gain clarity. We gain greater clarity of where we need to tread, and the Quran came for guidance. And that everyone should be fasting this month. So it's mainly legal rulings, you'll see here. And that Allah wants ease for us. And then we came with spoke about the prayer. And so now we shift back, okay, to more rulings pertaining to fasting. And so we've been talking about fasting. Now Allah's going to bring something else. He's going to talk about what we're fasting from now, what we're actually abstaining from. That's not been mentioned. Okay. So the first thing that we are abstaining from, that Allah mentions, is sexual relations. Okay. So Allah says, أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ لَيْلَةَ الصِّيَامِ الرَّفُثُ إِلَى نِسَائِكُمْ. Okay. So أُحِلَّ is a fourth form verb, or as I said, third form that I teach in the 10 forms, and it's أحل يحل. Yeah. إحلال. So the root is halala. It's a geminate verb. It's a doubled verb. So hence we've got this أحل, where the template is actually أفعل يفعل, but because it's geminate, it's doubled. That they merge together, and we need the haraka on the ha there, if you see that, ahalla, so we don't have a sukoon like here. So, but ahalla, the passive is, and we've seen quite a bit of passive here, is uhilla in the past. Okay, remember we make the passive by getting the 3 root letters and putting fu'ila, and the other forms follow suit. But there's always there's often alterations. But Dhamma, Kasra, Fatha, Uhilla. So this is the passive. So the origin of this part of the verse is أحل الله الرفث إلى نسائكم ليلة الصيام. So Allah has made permissible. Okay, notice he's used the past here to give certainty that it's definitely the case. Allah has made a rafatha permissible for you, ila nisaikum, to your wives, on a night of fasting. So we can see here that there's abnormal sentence structure here. So uhilla lakum, we mentioned previously when Allah says kutiba alaykum, fasting has been prescribed over you, that it's a burden. But if it was kutiba lakum, that it implies ease. So uhilla lakum, it's implying ease here now. And ahalla comes from the root ha lam lam, which means to unfasten something, to loosen something. So there's restriction and then there's release. That's the idea of the concept of halal. Specific notice, so there's a lot of abnormal sentence structure here. So uhilla, it's been made permissible. For who? That's the first question. For you, because we notice that you have been struggling, and so that's been brought forward. The focus is on you. There you are suffering, so specifically for you it's made permissible. Okay, the next focus is when. So we're not even mentioned what it is. That creates a delay in anticipation. When? Laylat as-siyam, the night of fasting. Okay. Now, why does it say the night of fasting? That's a question. Because you don't fast in a night. Okay. So it's mentioned thus to stress that obviously this is a time when the niyyah, the intention of fasting, is made. And so this implies, this verse, that it's required for us, in order to engage in fasting, to have an intention. And the validity of fasting is on that before you fast, you are present, you have presence of mind that you're going to perform the fast the next day. Okay. وَحِلَّ لَكُمْ لَيْلَةَ الصِّيَامِ. Okay. Now, what is it that's made permissible? So it creates that sort of anticipation. What is it that was been made permissible for me? So on the night of fasting, ar-rafathu. Now, rafath, what is a rafath? Rafath literally means an obscenity, something shameful regarding speech. It's usually shameful speech that's not to be uttered. It will cause a bit of embarrassment and shame in front of someone. That's the literal meaning of rafath, from ra, fa, tha. But it's come to mean other things. It's allegorious with sex, because obviously sex is something that generally people do not mention in the presence of other people. They keep it to themselves. And then it can also imply, secondarily, engaging with women in any sort of a flirtation. So that could be in terms of conversation, in terms of gaze, in terms of touch, and so forth. Now, why did Allah not mention sex explicitly? The scholars mention is that the reason this word's been used over other words that we have in the Quran for sex explicitly is because the Sahaba committed a shameful act. What's the context of this verse? There's two positions on this. One is that before, in the early days of fasting, one was not, and we mentioned this previously, that if once someone broke their fast at sunset, If they fell asleep at any time after sunset, and then when they woke up, it's not permissible to eat, drink, or have sexual relations until the next day. And then that ruling was removed. Now, many of the Sahaba found this very difficult. There was a situation with Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, when Umar left the home to get I can't remember why he left the home. But when he came back, his wife told him, "You can't have relations with me because I fell asleep." And Umar, in his disbelief, just didn't want to accept what had happened, and so he still had sexual relations with her. And there's other narrations that Ka'b ibn Malik, this happened to him. There's another narration of a Sahabi called Qais ibn Samurah. Qais, he went out to get some food, and then when he came back, his wife went out to get some food, I think it was, and when he came back, he'd fallen asleep, so he didn't even get to eat. So at sundown, they didn't have any food, so I think his wife went out, and he had fallen asleep, and so he had to fast the next day, and he struggled so much, and he came complaining to the Prophet ﷺ. He was almost faint. And so this ruling came to bring ease with the initial ruling. There's another narration that some of the Sahaba, they wanted to demonstrate their resilience and willpower, that they wouldn't eat at all. They tried to not eat at all throughout the whole month of Ramadan, even when the sunset came down. And this is interesting, because if we go with the first position, this is abrogating the original ruling, which was established by the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ established the initial ruling, because it's not mentioned in the Quran that you're not allowed to have sexual relations after falling asleep. So this is the Quran abrogating the Sunnah, and so this is abrogating. Whilst if we take the second position, it's regarding those people who were just trying to demonstrate that they didn't need to eat. Allah's just affirming that it's permissible for you to have sexual relations. That's what not. I apologise. It wasn't that they didn't eat or drink; they'd die. It's that they made a note. They basically didn't want to have any contact with their wives, sexual relations with their wives, to demonstrate their resilience. And then so Allah here is affirming that it's permissible for them to do so, and it's not an act of worship to do that. And so, if we go with the first position, it's abrogating, and secondly, it sort of fits the context as well, because the word rafath is being used for sex as an innuendo for something that's sort of unbecoming. They were doing something contravening the law, even though they were struggling. This is a lesson for us, is that as long as we're not, sometimes we do end up contravening the Sharia, but as long as we don't feel good about it, we did it in a state of weakness. Allah's there to forgive, and dispensations come for those people if they turn to Allah in dua, like the previous verse was mentioning. Often, more than not, Allah inspires us with a solution out of that situation, and this is what happened here for the Sahaba. And so you committed a wrong. So rafath is used here to say it wasn't really becoming. The scholars mention here that this is a proof that unless needed to be explicit, Allah is not explicit about crude matters or matters that are private and sensitive. And so Allah tries to use indirect language. And so that's a call to us as well, is that not to be completely obscene about words. And this is cultural. Each culture accepts different things as fitting or not fitting. But it's just a principle there. Now, the thing is, though, the word rafath usually uses the preposition be with it. Okay. So he rafathu bi kalamin qabih, for example, he uttered a grave obscenity, and we use ba with the object. It has a ba before the object, so the object's an indirect object because it takes a preposition. But here Allah uses ila, which is the preposition that's not usually used for this verb, to imply that what Allah's implying is sexual relations, because there's another verb that's Allah uses in the Quran, afda, which means to have sexual relations, and it uses the preposition ila with it. Okay, so this tells us that the ila is telling us that what's implied here is sex itself. Ila nisaikum, to your wives. Okay, or sorry, not to your wives. Nisa is being used here instead of wives. Okay, now that could imply that obviously, because in those days men had wives and had bondswomen, so it's saying it's permissible to your bondswomen. Okay, there's another interesting thing in the Quran that why does Allah use it nisa over azwaj? Okay, but obviously if Allah used azwaj, that would imply that if someone had a bondswoman, they would not be able to have sexual relations with them. So that's the reason there. So another interesting thing, nisa is the plural of imra'a, and Allah uses imra'a in the Quran when there's a sort of separation between the spouses. There's not a connection between them, i.e. there's discord between them, or there's a problem between them. And that is the context here. There's a problem here because they've been acting inappropriately. Okay, so that's another nuance there that can be drawn from it. Okay. And also what we take from this part of this verse is that sexual relations are not permissible in the day. Because if they're permissible at night, that insinuates that it's not permissible in the day. And so that's where we take the ruling that fasting is not just fasting from food and drink, but it's from sexual relations as well. And this is the first one that's explicitly mentioned what fasting is, i.e. fasting from sexual relations. And rafath, it can imply flirtation and foreplay and sexual relations. So that shows that we should be cautious, obviously, from in the day of any flirtatious behaviour, because part of the fasting is that we stay away from any sort of act that could lead to sexual relations. And then Allah says in a very famous part of the Quran, portion of the Quran, Hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun. Okay, notice women are mentioned first because that's who's been mentioned here. So this is an explanation. This sentence is an explanation for why it's permissible for you to have sexual relations in the evening after sundown. Because women, your wives, your women folk, are a form of clothing for you. Libas has a number of meanings. Here it can mean clothing, but it means to be connected, okay? And it means to be interlinked as well. That's the idea, and inseparable. It has these nuances, the word libas. So hunna, they are a form of clothing for you. Notice it's not definite. It's not saying they are clothing for you. They are a form of clothing for you. So that leads you to wonder. That Allah uses the indefinite. It leads you to wonder. Like, for example, I saw a cat. And so you start wondering, what was its colour? What was its size? Was it male or female? And so forth and so forth. And so this leads us to wonder how Allah uses the indefinite, so that we wonder how they are clothing for us. So they are clothing for you, and you, or antum, are clothing for them. Okay. So, as I said, this sentence is explaining the previous verse of why it's permissible to have sexual relations in Ramadan in the evening. Because men and women cannot do without one another. They have need for one another. And the context here is essentially about sexual relations, is that men and women incline towards one another. And in the sexual relations, in the embrace, it's like clothing. So that's one of the interpretations, and that's obviously the fundamental point being made here is that it's talking about sexual relations, is that when a man and a woman embrace, it's as if they are clothing one another. They become clothing for one another. They become so connected as if they're wrapped in one another that they become one. And this implies that we have to be conscious of that's our needs for one another. In Islam, the marriage contract is essentially, from a legal point of view, we're not dismissing that there are matters that are beyond besides sexual relations, but marriage is essentially, in the Islamic understanding, is a sexual contract that men and women yearn for one another, and we understand that as part of our biology. And so, because we know we have these cravings and yearnings for one another, we do so in a way that is proper, where the terms are laid out, that the community understand that the man and the woman are now taking on this contract of responsibility in order to gain a yearning and a need that they have. That if you have a need, the sexual contract, sexual yearnings, that it must be within a contract, and there must be responsibilities, and so you have responsibilities to one another, and that is implied in this verse as well, is that men and women are responsible for tending to one another's sexual needs. Okay, that's very important. And so it's not just about a man getting his need, it's about a woman getting her need as well. And so and obviously the men are mentioned first. Why? Because obviously the verse is starting with addressing men, but we can also understand that sometimes men outwardly, externally, they express their urges more. We could look at it from that, okay? But that women have urges as well, and so men have to tend to that and be sensitive to that. And when they engage in sexual relations, they do so in a way where they feel their satisfaction as well. This is all implied in this verse. Other said is that, and these are secondary meanings, is that men and women cover one another like clothes cover one another. And so clothes, we're inseparable from them. Most of the time we are wearing clothes to cover ourselves up, to protect one another. Okay. So not just protection from having sexual relations outside of marriage, but also protection financially, protection emotionally, and so forth and so forth. And so, and in conjugal relationships, and that you represent one another as well. And so you protect one another's names, you protect one another's honor. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, he said that this means they're sakanun, tranquility and repose, that they are repose for you. You find your true peace in working on your relationships with one another. And I stress this a lot in my talks that I give, is that if you want to know where you stand with Allah, know where you stand in your relationships. Human beings are fundamentally relational. And so for us to be whole, for us to find true peace, it's in connecting with another. You find this is very difficult today as we become more connected to things that are not human, and we find it hard to connect to other human beings by eye contact, by physical touch, by just engaging in conversation face to face. And so all these are implied in this verse about the importance of men and women not fighting against one another. This is another problem, is that we see men are the problem or women are the problem. No, we can't do without one another. And this is so common in the current political environment, not just amongst the sexes, but amongst the leanings of the right and the leanings of the left, is that they see the problem is with the other, and it's them who have to come round, and we have to resist them, and we have to fight them, and we have to make them submit. This is never going to work. A society will collapse if people take that approach to life. It's about how do we accommodate one another. Let's try to understand one another. Why is it you're taking these specific positions, and how can we come together to accommodate one another? Understanding one another, and then once understanding one another, trying to accommodate one another whereby there's a harmony. This is all implied in these verses. This is a very powerful verse as well. notice also that's interesting about this is that all these the fasting is preparing us for Hajj, because when we go into a state of ihram, we have to refrain from sexual relations as well. And notice that after Ramadan are the days of the months of Hajj, because Shawwal is considered the first month of Hajj. You say, how is Shawwal the first month? The first month of Hajj? It's because it's permissible for someone to actually go, and this is not very common today, and I don't think it would happen in most situations and places, is that someone could go theoretically into a state of ihram in Shawwal and then head towards Mecca. Okay, that's permissible. But sales in Ramadan, it's not permissible for me to head out from my home in a state of ihram to go to perform the Hajj. And so it becomes the point, like Shawwal is the month where we actually start initiating and preparing and get ourselves for Hajj. And fasting is a beautiful way to prepare ourselves, because it's abstinence, just as the state of ihram is abstinence. And so these verses are going to lead up to the verses of Hajj as well in Surah Baqarah. So there you go. I hope everything was clear for you and you benefited from that. So we will meet up, not tomorrow, I'll be away tomorrow, inshallah. So hopefully neither Thursday as well. For the next 2 days I can't. So the next lesson will be Friday, inshallah.